Welcome to another video in our series on generalized extreme value and nested logit models. Our last video briefly introduced some intuition for how we can think of the inclusive value term in a nested logit model. Now I'd like to show you how nested logit models are implemented in practice in cutting-edge research today. The paper that I'm about to show you analyzes a policy that the US government currently has of subsidizing airports and flights in small areas of the United States that are far away from big cities. This paper has many components that we've already talked about in terms of nesting structure, estimation, and consumer surplus and welfare calculations. So let's jump into the paper and see what it's about. But before we go too far into the paper, I wanted to talk about a general structure of nested logit that many papers in empirical industrial organization economics use. And that is the nesting of an outside good or a good that's not in the market separately from all the other goods that are in the market. If we think back to our commute choice model that we've been talking about with cars and different colored buses, we could think of there being, even aside from the transport option, another option that's just any way else to get to work. The models that we were covering before, they were focusing on just the transport and its subnodes in this graph. In practice, though, we could think of walking to work or riding a bike to work as being in this outside option. So this is a very common way that papers in industrial organization capture the fact that there's some number of participants that just don't enter the market. They're not interested in buying the good that we're analyzing. Now let's jump into the paper. This paper's by Austin Drukker. I occasionally play tennis with Austin, so he's a good guy, and this paper is really interesting. So the title is How Essential is Essential Air Service? The Value of Airport Access for Remote Communities. The policy that he's analyzing is a federal program called Essential Air Service, or EAS, and the question is this actually still essential? It was created almost 50 years ago as a temporary transition program, but now it costs almost $500 million to run. And it only serves 107 rural communities in the US. And so if you're wondering why did they even start this program, well, it was in the wake of airline deregulation in the 1970s and 80s, where they wanted to protect rural communities and make sure they didn't get isolated by suddenly having airlines not visit their airports. So a really important policy question that we need a structural model or a model with more structure to answer. What is being analyzed, or what is the choice set in this paper? We can think of somebody trying to go between Waterloo, Iowa and Washington, D.C. Reagan Airport. And there's a bunch of different ways that they can get there. They could take a direct flight, which is subsidized by the EAS program. They could take a flight to Chicago and then to DC on a regular airline, or they could drive to a bunch of nearby airports and then take a direct flight to Washington, DC. If we convert this map into a choice tree, we would get this nested structure. So I want to go from Waterloo to Washington, DC. I can choose to take an airline, or I can choose to do it somewhere else. I could drive there in my car, I could take a bus, a train, so forth. And then within the airline nest, there's a bunch of different options for how I could get there. I could take the EAS flight, I could drive to Des Moines and then fly, I could drive to Minneapolis and then fly, so on and so forth. So now that we understand the choice set, how is utility specified in this situation? The main thing I wanted to point out from the paper is that it has this multi-component error term that we talked about way back when in a few videos ago. And instead of having lambda times epsilon, we have 1 minus rho times epsilon. And then this eta it is taking the place of the new ij's or new ik's that we talked about in a prior video. So what does the model estimates imply, or what does Austin find in this paper? Well, people don't like higher airfares. That's not a surprise. They also don't like the time it takes to drive to an airport. And they don't really like the EAS flights. So this is just like independent of price and drive time. Do I like taking the subsidized flights? And the answer on average seems to be no. And then crucially, the nesting parameter is between 0 and 1. Now, in this case, it was expressed as 1 minus rho times epsilon, so we need to flip our intuition of what a high or low value of correlation is. In this case, we're finding a moderate amount of correlation among the flight alternatives, but not a substantial amount. If this nesting parameter were 0, then we would just get the typical type 1 extreme value multinomial logit. Now that we have estimates, we can start doing some consumer surplus calculations. And lo and behold, we have a very familiar formula here for the expected consumer surplus. We're dividing by 1 over the coefficient on price, and we have a log sum, and it looks like we have some nested logit log sum inclusive value terms here. So again, this looks like the inclusive value, and then we have Euler's constant on the end. So pretty neat stuff here that it's directly following what we've talked about. Now the question is, what is the consumer surplus over time from this program relative to what it costs? And this is actually really surprising and a little bit disappointing, if I'm honest. There's a lot of money being spent on this program for not very much consumer surplus. And that's tracing back to the fact that the consumers don't really like the EAS flights themselves, maybe because they only come once a day at a less convenient time. I'm not sure of all the intricacies of this market. But the point is it's basically at least 10x to 20x, even 30x more expensive to run the program than what people are getting out of it. So now let's think about a counterfactual where we shut down the airports let's pretend that the EAS program goes away. Which airports would be shut down? And the answer is about 30% of them, give or take. So that's a quick introduction to a really interesting paper that's applying these nested logit methods. You can go and read the paper yourself. It's on Austin's website. But I wanted to give you a taste for how modern empirical methods are using these nested logit principles to make more plausible policy recommendations. Up next, we're going to go through some more math to derive a whole family of GEV models that all come from a common constructor function that we'll go over. It's very interesting, and it opens us to additional horizons where we would not necessarily be limited to the hierarchical nesting structure that we've visited so far.